Excellent, we are live. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Emanuele. I am broadcasting from Italy. We're going to spend about a couple of hours discussing a topic which I am particularly interested in, and I very much hope that by the end of this talk and by the end of this discussion, I will not have given you answers because I don't have them, but I will have been able to provide at least some, let's call it food for thought or suggestions for further studies or inquiries that you might want to take. So this is not designed to be a talk specifically aimed at experts of martial arts, although of course they're very welcome. And it is so you can expect a certain amount of rather complex discussions, but broadly speaking, this is aimed at everybody who would fall into the category of educator. I use the word educator in the way that it is always consistently pushed by Parents International, which is an international organization which aims at providing support, training, and resources to parents, teachers, school leaders, and children all around the globe. And the way they conceptualize the idea of educator is anybody who is directly involved in the education of a child. So, not necessarily teachers. As a matter of fact, research tells us that the primary educators of children are, in fact, their parents. So, by the same token, however, even the football coach or any sport coach or anybody who is directly involved in providing support and help and guidance to a child, as a matter of fact, is indeed an educator. Therefore, even those of you who train children or that whose children are training in martial arts can probably benefit from what we're going to discuss here tonight. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about myself, and then I'll tell you what we are going to discuss in a bit more detail over the course of the evening. There will be a moment, I would say, for about 15, 20 minutes of questions in case any of you has any. Otherwise, I'll thank you for your time, and I hope for you that this discussion will be helpful and interesting. So, as with regards to myself, I am, as I said before, I'm Italian. You will hear it in my accent, which fluctuates a little bit. So, forgive the inconsistency. I'll do my best to be understandable from the beginning to the end. I studied Japanese language and literature in Rome. I moved to Japan to work for quite a few years. I have practiced judo for around 30 years and kendo for about 10. And in my greener days, so to speak, I worked as an instructor, primarily in judo, which is where my direct experience comes from with regards to training to training children in martial arts. So this is a combination of my studies as well as my own, let's say, direct experience. So what we're going to do this evening, or we're going to focus on, can be summarized in as follows. We're going to very briefly touch upon the origin, the context from which martial arts originated in Japan, of course, and then we're going to have a look at the at how they morphed from let's say a system that was designed to obtain supremacy in combat to a system that was reinterpreted as a way to educate human beings from, let's say, an holistic perspective. We will then discuss in a bit more detail the physical and psychological impact of the practice of martial arts. And we will conclude with a brief discussion of how martial arts can be conducive to inclusion, with a specific focus on the integration of Muslim practitioners, because there are some details that need to be taken into account to make sure that experience is equally effective and productive for the trainer and for the trainees. We will also, of course, discuss not simply the perspective of our psychology, so to speak, which we'll briefly touch upon, particularly with regards to integration of the shadow, but we'll also concentrate on the way that the East, and specifically Japan and China, analyzed and conceptualized the human being. So we have quite a bit of ground to cover. 2 hours might not be sufficient, but I will do my best. So, for starters, let's take a look at the battlefield experience from which Japanese martial arts in particular derive. This, of course, is not meant to be a celebration of violence per se. That's not what I intend to do here, or a celebration of death, which we will have to discuss anyways. But it is very important that we understand and that we identify the starting point of the evolution of martial arts from the historical and pragmatic context from which they came, which is in fact battlefield. So, in as few words as possible, martial arts were designed and developed over the course of time to make sure that somebody could obtain supremacy onto the battlefield. So you have two words here that are fundamental for our discussion. One is yoroi kumiuchi, that would be hand-to-hand, close-quarter combat wearing armor. The other one is kaisha kenjutsu, which is the old form of sword fighting. And then you've got gunki monogatari, which is a branch of Japanese literature that is to some extent similar to epic literature in the classical sense. So it is a collection of stories or poems that were written to celebrate the feat of arms of heroes and champions in medieval Japan. So let's begin with discussing the pragmatics of the battlefield, so to speak. As you might have seen films depicting battles between samurai, or bushi, which is the correct term. You need to remember that broadly speaking, those representations are designed to be pleasing to the eye of the Western audience, and they're not exactly trustworthy reproductions of what battles actually looked like in medieval Japan. So in terms of the time frame, we are somewhere around the 12th or 13th century of the Christian era, and the way battles were fought by bushi, which is by people that were directly engaged in the profession of soldiery, we can say that. So by those that belong to the families that were by tradition soldiers or fighters, was started with first a salvo of archery, and then you would have the individual duels between people that were more or less of the same social status. The way they ascertained that was with a process called nanori, which means that someone would step forth, declare his name, declare his rank or his status, and challenge anyone from the ranks of the other army to come forward and do battle with him. And they would typically be mounted both on horses. So they would first fight well mounted. At some point, if any of the two dismounted or both dismounted, then the fight would then turn into a close quarter combat proper, which would typically end with the death of one of the two. So in the way in which the Gunki Monogatari, the literally epic of wartime Japan, right? Sorry, the epic descriptions of battles during medieval Japan typically describe the end of one such duels, is that one of the two would throw the adversary to the ground, pin him down, lift the armor, and strike one of the areas being left exposed, and so kill the other one. Typically, the whole sequence ends with the removal of the head, which was part of the tradition. So the origin of hand-to-hand combat, so the origin of what Kōdōkan Judo is today, is traceable to the practice of the Yoroi Komyuchi. Of course, times changed. So over the course of time, armor became useless, chiefly because as a consequence of the introduction of firearms. And the ways to throw or pin down the opponent evolved as well. But that is by and large the starting point of the evolution of hand-to-hand combat in Japan. A very similar thing can be said of sword fighting, which nowadays is called kendo, which comes from kenjutsu, specifically kaisha kenjutsu, which is kenjutsu practiced with the armor. So the ability required by the practitioner would be the one that would enable someone, to strike the areas of the opponent's body where the armor would be thinner or would leave the body exposed. Okay, so this is very strictly speaking connected to supremacy onto the battlefield, which means one of the two makes it out alive and the other one dies. There isn't much room for Western style chivalry in medieval Japan. It's simply a matter of very basic life and death. So simply that. Part of the reason why the warrior class, the Bushi, became so deeply intertwined with the Zen philosophy, although not the only reason, is also because owing to the fact that Zen philosophy, particularly the one that was embraced by the warrior class, which is the Rinzai style, focused as a form of Buddhism, not so much on the permanence and of human life and on maintaining the status quo, but on the fact that life is in fact finite and fleeting, and any instant could be the last one. So that would be the mindset that warriors would consider desirable. We'll see why then, because the psychology of combat has been discussed multiple times at great length by Japanese authors in ways that are frankly quite surprising and with very interesting insights. So that would be the beginning of our story, right? Would fight each other, and then, if we are to believe, sorry, we're having problems with the connectivity. Apologies. If we are to believe the historical documents tracing the lineage of the schools, then what happened is that many people, many masters would then analyze the techniques or the movements that were the most effective, and then selecting them into structures that would then become what's called ryuha, so the schools and the styles of the different martial arts. So there was an ongoing reflection primarily focused on efficiency. So the ultimate goal was to obtain victory under a multiplicity of situations, facing several odds. so armed, unarmed. Um, and of course, the discussion would include then the terrain, would include many aspects, including one's own internal world, so to speak. So one's psychological posture, so to speak, which is very interesting, of course. But so the question would be, how exactly did this turn from a simple mean to obtain a very precise goal, so my life and your death, um, to put it mildly, to ways that can be used to cultivate the human being from the physical perspective, from the psychological perspective, not so much the spiritual, and we'll see why, but certainly physical and psychological, as well as ethical. That's a very interesting turn. So let's take a look at how that um, came to be. If I can find my okay, there you go. Okay, so the two texts that you've got here are not Japanese. They are Chinese. One is the Tao Te Ching, which is the founding text of Taoism, and the other one, which I written in its Japanese form, it's actually a Chinese text. It's called Sanryaku, which is the three strategies. The full title is the three strategies of the Duke of the Yellow Cliff. Are two very different texts from the Chinese literary tradition, which can be considered as the forerunners of the shift that will then take Japanese martial arts from a tool and an instrument for battle and death to a tool and an instrument, and what's more, a way, so to speak, to cultivate human beings. So, as you might know, the Tao Te Ching, as the founding text of Taoism, is primarily concerned with explaining, as much as possible, the concept of Tao, which is sometimes translated as way, but it's not only that. And crucially, the organization of reality in its fundamental components and the continuous change that reality undergoes. So, if you have heard, you probably know the terms yin and yang. They are, of course, part of the discussion proposed by the Tao Te Ching, and so there would simply be in the from the perspective of the Tao Te Ching, the two tendencies, so to speak, the two forms in which change continuously occurs. So the Tao Te Ching and the theoretical author, we don't exactly know who he was, but the tradition says it was Lao Tzu, which simply means the old master. So it could be anybody. It could also be a collective text. We don't exactly know. But the way Lao Tzu interpreted reality is as follows: as a continuous interplay between not really two forces, it's a bit more complex than that, but two, let's say, fundamental elements, fundamental trends. One would be yin and one would be yang, which then can be classified as, for example, female and male, so it would be yin and yang, or dark and light, again, or it could be cold or hot, and so forth. And so the combination of these two elements, of these two tendencies in a yang, is what brings reality into being. The interesting thing is that this is also directly linked not just to the physical reality, but to the psychological reality as well. So all the thoughts, all the emotions, all the aspirations, all of that can be analyzed in terms of yin and yang, in terms of change, in terms of continuous transformation. And in with regards to this, the Tao Te Ching says something very interesting, which is the following. One of the two possible oppositions, one of the two possible incarnations of the yin and yang duality is soft and hard. And what the Tao Te Ching says is the following: since the soft, for example, in case of children, is associated with life, and hard is associated with death, because if you think about it, the Tao Te Ching says small children are extremely flexible, and people that are of a certain age start becoming stiffer and stiffer. So, which means that life tends towards flexibility, and death towards um, rigidity. Therefore, the Tao Te Ching says, even though it's important to recognize that the two are continuously intertwining and changing one to the other, the one that ends up winning is necessarily softness, is necessarily yielding. So it's necessarily, it says very plainly, the yin principle, the feminine principle, in a way, which doesn't mean it's not categorized in terms of men versus women. This is a modern and pretty shallow way of oversimplifying the message. The core idea is that flexibility in general is preferable because it is directly linked with the reality of life, which tends to be flexible, adaptable, uh, ready to change, willing to change, whereas rigidity tends to inevitably lead towards death. And so that's not the way that things are supposed to be oriented towards. So the second step that we have, I'll show you again, is in the discussion of the Saryaku, there is a very particular sentence which has been mentioned several times, both in Japanese text and in the modern discourse by many researchers, which is the one that you can see here in characters, which reads, that which is flexible can control or dominate or subjugate or rule that which is hard or rigid. However, there is one element that's missing for us to be able to understand what this means precisely. So this text here, the Saryaku, which is part of the classical Chinese classics or military classics, it is not a book that discusses hand-to-hand combat. It's not a book that discusses individual actions. It's a book that was designed to explain large-scale strategy. Specifically, the book itself is divided in 3 sections, hence the title, The Three Strategies. When it comes to discussing how to manage or rule the territory taken from an opponent, or one's own territory as well, the Saryaku says that there are 2 ways in which things can be managed. One is through virtue, and one is through imposition, right? So as you can imagine, given that this is also influenced by the Taoist perspective, the ethical way of running things, so the one associated with virtue, is directly linked to the concept of softness and flexibility. And on the other hand, the way of the imposition is directly linked to stiffness. So what the Saryaku says with this particular sentence is not you can win in a hand-to-hand fight by yielding to your opponent. It's not that. What he's saying is if you have to rule, to organize something, if you're leading something that requires large-scale strategy and operations, leading by virtue is far more preferable and far more effective than running things by imposition. Now, this book is over 1,500 years old. So, but it's interesting to notice, in my opinion, the shift from pure application of physical military power to obtain a certain goal in the immediate, let's say, moment, to let's consider things on a larger time frame. And let's find ways to keep things balanced and stable. And the way to do that is to resort to virtue and not imposition. So even though it's a military classic, as you can see, this is not simply you win by doing this, as in you crush your opponent by doing this. Victory, in fact, as it is defined in the most famous of the Chinese classics, which is The Art of War, is uh, is best obtained without fighting. In other words, the good general, says The Art of War, is the one that wins without fighting, not the one that wins 100 battles, the one that doesn't need to fight a single one. So again, as you see, we can notice the emergence of the concept of softness and flexibility, not in the sense of yielding per se, but in the sense of finding a way through virtue, which is the key idea, finding a way to reach the objective in an ethically acceptable way, in a virtuous way, which is very, very important. These ideas, of course, were born and developed in China, and they reached Japan over the course of the centuries because um, the tendency of Japanese culture across the centuries is to move from an extreme to another. So from a moment where the country is very open and imports a lot from the outside, which means China, historically speaking, China and Korea, to moments where the country closes and whatever has been imported is assimilated in such a way that it doesn't lose its value, but it doesn't remain exactly foreign. It becomes part integrated into the fabric of Japanese culture, which is something that, historically speaking, Japanese people and Japan are really good at. So now that we have established broadly speaking, the concept of flexibility and rigidity connected to ethics for flexibility and imposition for rigidity, we can then take a further step down the road and see how these things become integrated into the practice of martial arts. Okay, so we started our discussion with a very brief introduction to the ways in which battles were fought, battles between bushi, between warriors of the warrior class, were fought in 12th and 13th century Japan. Now, I will not bore you with a long lecture on Japanese history, but we can say that by the beginning of the 17th century, wars in Japan had largely subsided, so the country was unified under the rule of a family called Tokugawa, which means that uh, many things had to change in Japanese society precisely because after centuries of essentially never-ending wars or um, centuries in which maintaining a high level of readiness, with many people able to fight competently. So, with many people that would be trained in schools in systematized fighting methods was absolutely indispensable because wars could break out at any moment, essentially. When Japan becomes unified under the rule of the Tokugawa family, all this ceases to some extent because there are no more large scale battles to be fought. So um, combat turns into something that is essentially limited to the single individual. It doesn't mean that you don't need to fight anymore, of course, because you still have crimes, you still have um, individual duels for whatever reason. All these things still exist, but the large, let's say that the political situation, the social situation has changed to such an extent that now it becomes possible to reflect on these techniques and these schools and these fighting methods, and not just concentrating on developing them further from the technical point of view. Now that the war is no longer raging, the experts or the masters can take the time to reflect upon their tradition and connect it not just to the immediate result, victory, but they can infuse them with a deeper meaning, or put it in a different way, they can find, which will be the case of Takwon, which we'll discuss first, they can find that what they teach from the philosophical point of view is actually already incarnated in the practice of martial arts, which arose from the need to fight and win. So we have two main authors when we discuss not exactly philosophers, but people that tried to combine the martial tradition with the Buddhist philosophy, right? We have Takuan, which was a Zen master of the Rinzai school, and we have Yagyu Munenori, who was the one of the leading swordsmen of his time, again 17th century, and also the Iemoto, which is the head of one of the most prestigious um, schools of sword fighting in Japan. So let's begin with Takwon. If you have had the chance to read Yoshikawa Eiji's novel Musashi, or if you have seen the film or any of the films, you've probably encountered the let's say unhistorical idea that Takuan and Miyamoto Musashi, the author of the Book of Five Rings, the greatest swordsman Japan has ever had, met, and that Musashi learned from Takuan directly. This is not historically attested. It's not impossible, but there is no way to prove it, let's say, as of now. However, it is beyond doubt that Musashi was aware of Takuan's teachings and did include many of the same ideas that Takuan put forward in his own works, which again doesn't mean that he learned them from Takuan, but it means that those ideas already circulated broadly and they were famous enough to be included in Musashi's work as well as in Yagyu Munenori's work. Now, why exactly would a Buddhist priest or a Buddhist master choose to reflect on the practice of martial arts, and specifically on the practice of sword fighting, can be a baffling question, right? From their perspective, it was actually perfectly normal. But if we are still, let's say, used to the idea that Buddhism essentially is about relaxing and keeping your peace, then of course, let's say, combining Buddhism with hand-to-hand combat or sword fighting seems completely far-fetched. The fact is that we have most of us, I mean, at least among the large let's say the general public, have a rather biased way of what Buddhism is, and certainly a biased way of what Zen is. When you mention Zen, very typically you would hear comments or responses like, yeah, it's about relaxing, it's about finding your center, which is not wrong, but it's not just that. It's a lot more complicated than that. So what Takuan does essentially is it's already complicated by the fact he is educated in a time, again the 17th century, in which you have you can say you have freedom of religion in Japan. So there are three main traditions. You've got Buddhism, which came from India through China. You've got Shinto, which is essentially the original aboriginal tradition of Japan. which intermingled with the other traditions and then changed over time. Broadly speaking, it's indigenous to the archipelago. And then you have Neo-Confucianism, which is not exactly religion; it's a philosophy, but it's nonetheless extremely important to understand how the, let's say, the cultural landscape of Japan in the century we're discussing now came to be. So let's take a look at Buddhism first, and then we'll discuss Neo-Confucianism, and then we'll see how Takuan combines the two. Now, Buddhism isn't exactly an easy topic, and it's not something that can be analyzed at length in detail in a couple of hours, right? So saying something that, like, I understand Buddhism, it's pretty preposterous. So what I can offer is a little insight into some of the key concepts and see how they link to the discussion that we are having now. So one thing which is probably a good idea to put forward immediately is that, as you may know, Buddhism does not see life as ending with one's death. So Buddhism embraces the concept, which was already very well established in Hinduism, that of reincarnation, meaning that, of course, you don't return with your own body, with the body in which you are inhabiting now. What comes back is something else, or let's say what manifests again. It's probably a better way to put it. Um, is in a way it's something else, but it's also in a way the same. So this is already getting complicated, but let me explain. So, anyways, unlike us in the West, at least for those that have let's say that are familiar with the Judeo-Christian roots of the culture in the West, life has a beginning, has an end, and after the end, then you have the reckoning. It's not so in Buddhism, which at least partially explains why the view of death in Japan is so different from ours, right? So this is one thing that's crucial to identify. Meaning, for many of us, death is probably the worst thing that can happen when we try to think about the worst, right? In Japan, especially in the period we are discussing, so the 17th century of the Christian era, that's very much not the case. So the worst thing that can happen is mostly linked to shame, and rather than losing your life, precisely because since this life is finite, and then after this there will be another one and another one and another one, losing this, so facing the end of your life, of your current life, is a given. So it does not bear the same gravitas as facing one's death bears in the West, for example. So in addition to that, since the society of the era was very, very strictly organized according to a very precise hierarchy, in many cases, especially for people living inside the culture of the warrior class, one's death was sometimes the only way in which one could prove his own honesty or his own sincerity or his own loyalty. So to give you an example, if a retainer, so a low-level samurai, a low-level bushi, understood or noticed that his lord, his master, was doing something wrong, he had according to the Confucian societal rules, he had the duty to put it forward to the master, but also he had to do so in such a fashion as not to offend him, because of course the social status was not the same. So he couldn't simply go to his lord and say, you are wrong. He had to do so in a way that was accepted. And if he refused, if the master refused, if the lord refused, but the retainer was still convinced that he was in the right, and so that the behavior of his lord was unacceptable, the only way in which he could actually prove that he was doing so not for selfish reasons, but out of loyalty and respect for his master, was to kill himself. It sounds contradictory, but it's exactly how it is. And not just in any particular way, because as you know, the prescribed way of dying for a member of the bushi class or the warrior class was seppuku, so which is very painful and involves a great deal of suffering and pain. So this is, in the eyes of the Japanese of the period, and to some extent in the eyes of the modern Japanese, that level of pain and the willingness to undergo the ordeal, and so to end one's life in such a brutal and dramatic fashion, was the 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 best possible demonstration that that person was actually earnest and honest and motivated by non-selfish reasons. So you can see how this conflicts with the idea that we have, of course, that life is to be preserved at all costs. That's the most important thing that we have. Which isn't to say that any of these two views is right or wrong, but it's important to understand that these differences are present. They were very much alive, historically speaking, and to some extent, they still are, which, for example, explains, at least in part, the high rate of suicides in Japan. Suicide with us, again, it's a very delicate topic, so one doesn't want to oversimplify it, but um, um, let's put it this way. So, from a personal perspective, I have heard multiple comments by people discussing the suicide, for example, of one of the foremost Japanese writers, who was Mishima Yukio, who killed himself by seppuku in the 70s, and they were asking whether this was seen as an act of cowardice. And of course, the Japanese person who was with me responded simply, "No, really, that's not how we see it, and that's not why he did it." So it's not something that you do in desperation because you understand there is no way out. It's something else. And to go back to the Bunki Monogatari, to the war, to the epic war literature, the hero of the Japanese tradition, which is Minamoto no Yoshitsune, his own story ends in suicide when he's cornered and he has no way out. So rather than being taken, he's being chased by his brother, by the way. So that says something about the relationship between kins back in the day. Rather than do so, then he decides that what he must do is something else. So again, the view of death is therefore very different, and it does play a role. But that aside, and going back to Buddhism, Buddhism does not see death in the same way as Christianity does, for example, because um, it's never final unless you have managed to do something or to do things in such a fashion that you can stop the the fact that you will be reborn. So, as ironic as it might seem, from by the Buddhist perspective, the fact that you are born um, is actually identified as one of the, not exactly the causes, but one of the ways in which you experience pain and suffering, precisely because you are born into this world, which means inevitably that you will then grow and you will experience old age and you will experience sickness, illness, and you will experience eventually death. So this is very much present in the minds of both the masters and the commoners, right? It's not something that they can dispense with the way we do, or we tend to do, for example, in our societies. In Japan, in that period, and today as well, particularly for those um, like the Bushi class who, going on to the battlefield, might meet their demise literally any moment. So Buddhism doesn't focus much onto saving the body, so to speak, but it focuses um, very acutely on understanding the let's say the inner world of of humans. And so again, without going into too much detail, but there is something to be said about the way the Buddhism and particularly Zen discusses what's inside a human being. So we are used to thinking, for example, that if we discuss the mind, we typically associate with your head or your brain. And if you discuss your feelings, you typically associate it with your heart. Now, this framework works very well for us, but it doesn't really work when we try to make a parallel between what we have and what Buddhism has, particularly Zen, because Buddhism and Zen discuss a concept that's called Shin, which is a bit of both and also something else. So you could see the Shin, so the heart mind, it's sometimes translated, but it's not a very convincing way. The heart mind is described as often as the field from which your consciousness, your mental processes, your perceptions, all that stems and lives. So what the Zen masters say is that this Shin, which is again we could call it the heart mind if you want, um, what we really need to focus on is not so much on what happens on the outside because that's beyond our control. What we need to focus on is the way in which our Shin reacts to these things, or better still, does not react. So here's what happens: the classical, what is it? That's um, the classical metaphor is that the Shin should be like a mirror. So what does a mirror do? Whatever passes in front of it, the mirror reflects exactly as it is. And at the same time, while it reflects it, is not influenced by it, right? Another classical metaphor would be the moon uh, crossing the sky and reflecting on a pond, on a lake. So long as the water is still, the moon is reflected uh, perfectly. But as soon as you break the surface of the water, then little waves start rippling, and the image of the moon is broken in a thousand pieces. And until the surface of the water becomes still again, then of course the moon cannot be reflected in its entirety. So much in the same way, what Zen says is what you need to do is train your heart mind, your Shin, um, to such an extent that whatever happens outside or inside of you, it's never unbalanced. It's never broken. It's never, if you think about it as a mirror, it's never clouded, right? If you think about it as a pond, its surface is always calm and never broken or never affected by waves. So if you do that, what happens is that whatever is outside will be reflected exactly as it is, so not in a biased way, not in an altered way, exactly as it is, and at the same time you will not be unbalanced. So this is supremely important for people that have to engage in a life or death fight, because of course, and that's the intuition that Taquan has and many other masters have, if you are not in a, let's say, if you adopt a psychological posture that is unbalanced, that is biased, that is clouded by whatever fear, preoccupation, anger, then of course you cannot clearly see reality as it is. And reality in that particular context is the person in front of you trying to kill you. Therefore, the best thing you can do for yourself is train yourself to be or train yourself to the point that you become able to face death and just be like a mirror. Meaning, if you learn to do so in the extreme event of a life and death duel, it means you can do so in everyday life as well. And if you can do that in everyday life as well, that means that you can go through your life in that particular state of psychological posture, internal balance, you name it, which means you can function much better, both as a human being and as an actor of, let's say, ethics or good or whatever else. That is the moment in which things shift. So the reason why Takwan insists so much, and the reason why he says one of his most famous sentences that the sword and Zen are one, is precisely because it's not so much the fact that you need to be relaxed or peace or whatever. No, no, no. It's the fact that you are, if you practice um, swordsmanship, right? Kendō, whatever, and you face death, right? And you're able to do so with your heart as a mirror. It means that you have actually mastered yourself to the point that you can conduct yourself in that same fashion in any other circumstance, right? Precisely because it's the most extreme situation you can possibly face, because it's life and death, right? So, from that, Takuan writes. It's like it's now it's a book, but it was intended as a letter, which is called Fudochi Shinyoroku, to this master called Yagi Munenori, and explains his view. Although Takuan was not himself um, a student of kenjutsu or anything, he didn't practice any martial art, but he explains to this master why what he teaches, so why the teaching of Buddhism, and what the master actually does in practice without knowing it is actually the same, one and the same, potentially one and the same. So Taekwondo never says that simply by practicing that particular school or a certain martial art, you will automatically obtain this particular state of heart mind. It doesn't say that. It's not automatic, of course. But he says that practicing martial arts with that mindset is one of the opportunities that could lead to the acquisition of that particular state of heart mind. Right? So let me open back the slide and I'll show you uh, one more thing. Right. So the very first word that you see there, which is this one, Fudoshin, that's the word we've been discussing so far, the word for heart or heart mind. The two characters that come before that, Fudo, simply mean no or not, and then movement. Meaning, if you have trained yourself to the point that your heart mind is like a mirror, so it is not unbalanced or adversely influenced or taken by whatever stimuli can come from outside or inside, it means that your heart is not moving. It doesn't mean that you are heartless, of course. It doesn't mean that you are without pity. That's not the case. It means that you're still able to possess your heart and mind in such a fashion that it is balanced. It's not, let's say, it's not unbalanced or biased in any particular direction, and therefore it's able to move, so to react freely, no matter what happens, right? So again, as you can imagine, this is really practical in terms of combat application, because it means that you can then adapt to what happens outside of you without fear, without being impeded by your own preoccupations and so forth, right? So the other man, the sword master that we discussed before, Yagi Munenori, who wrote himself a treaty called Heihoka Densho, so the tradition of a student of martial arts, of the science of war, in other words, he discusses these two terms. The first one is Satsujinto, which means the sword that kills people, and katsujinken, which is the sword that makes people live. Okay, this is a critical distinction. And he chooses that in, you see, there's a significant difference in the characters he chose. One is the character for katana, so for the proper sword, the blade itself. The other one is ken, is a sword that does not have the curved shape of a katana. So broadly speaking, it's a sword that's not designed to, so it's not the samurai sword, but the difference is this, essentially. What he says is that the sword is a sword anyway. The difference is if you use it to perform that which is bad, then obviously it is a sword that kills. If you use it to perform that which is good, then of course it is a sword that lets people live. It's not really that gives life, but it's a sword that is used to save people or to keep people safe. So this is again critical distinction. There are very few absolutes when it comes to a discussion of to a Buddhist discussion, right? And there are also very few absolutes in the discussion of the ethical implications of martial arts. What Yagyu Monenori is saying here is you do have a sword, which is, of course, an instrument developed to take someone's life. There might be a case when you have no other choice but to use it to prevent other people from dying. That would be an example of a sword that gives life. On the other hand, if you just misuse what you have, so if you just take the instrument and you take the simplest possible route and just use your skill to perform what you can, although you shouldn't, then that's a sword that takes life, not a sword that gives life. So again, you see that there's a very precise ethical implication with regards to what is to the difference between what you can do in terms of competence of ability and what you should do. It's very much not the same. So you do see that at this point we're just now talking about what kind of effect the practice can have on you physically. It's not just what kind of effect it can have on you psychologically. It's also something. It's a view of what kind of end you use your capacity and your tools for. So it's an ethical discussion. And so we're covering right now through the very same thing, the very same structure. We're covering the physical perspective, so the cultivation of your body, right? Your psychological perspective, so the ability to maintain readiness, adaptability under duress, under stress, and eventually to face, of course, the perspective of death, and the ethical perspective of you are currently living in this particular moment. You can do these things. You have these tools. What do you use them for? It's not the tool that defines good or bad. It is the use of the tool. So it is the how you deploy your ability, your competence, your capacity, and your tools that defines what is good and bad, right? So again, it could be debatable, but this is the perspective that Yagyu Munenori and Takuan are discussing right here. All right. Okay. So let me take you back very quickly. And here we go. Okay. So with regards to, let's say, the Buddhist perspective, we can stop. We can stop here. There is something still in the discussion of Takuan in the Fudoshi Shimyoroku that also connects with the Neo-Confucian philosophical discussion, which is very, very important for what we are doing, which is the expression that is here. It's called Kei no Ji. Kei means respect, and Ji means character. So Um, this expression here, kenōji, is in the Neo-Confucian discourse to indicate the condition in which your mind, so the word they used in the text is shin, which is essentially, it's the same character of the Japanese shin. Um, Again, so it could be heart and mind. It's the from the global point of view, it's your mental activity, right? Including your perception, your reflections and stuff. So the kenōji is the condition in which your thoughts, your mind is capable of reflecting on things without dwelling on them, without becoming prisoner of what it's trying to understand. So again, Neo-Confucianism is not a philosophy, so it's not discussing this in terms of what leads to salvation or to liberation. It's discussing this from the perspective of you as a human have an insatiable necessity to understand reality. You can only do so if your mind or heart are unclouded. So if they are sufficiently receptive and flexible to understand, to analyze, to perceive without bias, right? So without prejudging what one thing could be or could not be, which is very, very crucial, of course. Now, Confucianism, strictly speaking, predates Neo-Confucianism, obviously. Neo-Confucianism is a re-elaboration that starts in around the 10th century of the Christian era, whereas Confucianism starts much, much earlier, of course. Um, and it carries over from Confucianism the original aim, which was to provide a framework to stabilize society, to stabilize first the family and then society, and then, of course, the country, because there are three levels of the same structure, so to speak. Um, and the reason why this is because Confucius lived in a period in which China was rife with wars and it was divided over many in multiple independent kingdoms. There was no unified China as we know it today. So Confucius' response, as the teacher who he was to refuse to engage with the metaphysical, we can say. He does say directly in the Analects, he acknowledges that there might be, of course, gods, spirits, unexplainable features, but it does not concern you. And it does not concern you as much as building a proper functioning society concerns you because you're a human, right? So his response to the uh, continuous, never-ending state of war is to establish a structure that can stabilize the situation at the level of the individual as part of a family, which is the foundation of the nation, right? So the way he does that um, is to exemplify the position of the individual relative to everyone else. This is a delicate topic, especially for the Western audience, because we have now we have become, let's say, less receptive to the idea of hierarchy, of place, of norms, of social expectations, and so forth. It's very not much the case in Asia, and it's certainly not the case in East Asia, where Confucianism is still the basis for your everyday life. So, for example, the head of the family in the system of Confucius is the father. There is no way in which you can possibly escape the relationship with the father in terms of over in terms of higher and lower, right? Which doesn't mean, however, that you have no rights or that the father has absolute power over you, pater familias style, as in Rome. Uh, in Confucianism, it's stated very clearly that the relationship goes both ways. So those that are at the top have the responsibility to take care of those that are at the bottom or in the lower position. and vice versa. Those in a lower position have the duty, the responsibility to be respectful of the elders or those in a higher position. We might not, appreciate the perspective, but this is simply the reality on the ground. So whenever you enter the practice of martial arts, this is the system you're walking in inevitably. Which doesn't mean, of course, that if your master knows what he's doing, that he will impose his will upon you, or that he will act in a way that is oppressive. It just means that the system will inevitably put you in a position where you need to show and respect, and whereas the master is of course will need to embody those principles, but the master is the master and the student is the student. Simply that, right? So the step of New Confucianism is to move from that particular situation, so social structure, relationship between people, and virtues that guide those relationships, and add the metaphysical piece. So fundamentally, the New Confucian ask themselves, perfect. So society works this way. How is it that what about the structure of reality? What about the structure of the universe, of the world? How does this work? What they try to do is they try to put everything together in one unified theory. So it's an incredible undertaking. It's a very, very, very interesting um, school of philosophy, which of course we can't discuss there in detail. But I'll just go over very quickly two terms that we need to have in our toolbox before we move to the next passage, which are ri, which means broadly speaking principle, and ki, which is a bit more problematic. Okay, here we go. So you can see that here again. This is extremely simplified. It's a lot more complicated than this. But the very first character, this one, the one that says ri, you can think of this as the as the principle that is present in everything that exists, right? So imagine ri as the instructions for reality. Okay. New Confucians never think of the ri in terms of God, right? What they do is they recognize that reality as we experience it daily has an underlying structure. For example, they notice that there is a regular um, transformation of day into night and night into day and so forth. They notice that people go through the stages of life in the same fashion. So they are born in such a way that they grow, and then they die, they age, and then they die. They notice the existence of seasons. They notice the regularities in the cycles of nature and so forth. All this indicates, in that perspective, the existence of something that can be defined as a unifying underlying principle, right? So it's not something that can be pinpointed physically. So you cannot touch the principle, but you can deduce the principle exists based on your observation of reality, right? This is critically important. So it's a bit, if you will, it's a bit when you hear a discussion of the emergence of the scientific method, and the fact that many of the first scientists, so to speak, um, were came from religious background, and some I've heard this point being made by a prominent scholar. Some might say that they found the certain constants or the underlying mathematical reality in nature because they looked for it, because they thought that there was such a structure and such a they expected to find um, reason and again and principle and structure. They didn't expect just chaos, right? Because as a matter of fact, we experience reality not simply as purely chaos. right? There are things that are regular, that can be predicted, right? So in the 10th century China, which didn't have the access to knowledge that we have now, or the tools that we have now, simply observing reality would lead them to the conclusion that there was indeed an underlying principle that could be observed in action, not pinpointed physically. So that's what the Ri is, right? The Ri is that which the organizing principle of reality, right? The principle needs to be enacted in practice. So it's a material, so to speak. It needs a stuff that can organize, that can structure, that can organize, right? To physically make reality. That is what the Neo-Confucian call chi, and that's what in Japanese is then called ki. So when you hear low-level discussions about martial arts, typically people would say that ki is energy. That's very much not the case. So energy is viable if we consider it in as the physics define it, but it's definitely not a good reading. It's not supported by any kind of historical evidence that the Chinese of the past ever thought of chi or ki as energy. It just doesn't happen. Specifically, the Neo-Confucians again saw ki or chi as the material, the physical element, the physical stuff that then organized and to build reality. So this is what they came up with to explain how reality works. You've got this principle, and you've got the stuff that is then organized with the changes with the yin-yang stuff and transformation, because nothing is stable, nothing is forever the same. They notice that immediately, of course. So this is how things work. Meaning that when you buy into this system, of course, you are then, let's say, not pushed really, but you are confronted with the idea that you are, although you are an individual, you are part of something that is designed to be in such a way that has certain rules, that has certain expectations, and so on and so forth, right? So Daquan takes this and combines it with the teachings of the Rinzai, and then that is how he develops his own particular take on on the faith, and also on the practice of martial arts. Now, this is important because the discourse of the martial arts discourse is very much prone to using ki as, let's say, in a general way, but it's not simply that, it's not simply use your energy. It doesn't work like that. What it means is you can use what actually makes reality. And of course, ki is not simply that which makes reality in a physical sense. It's also the fundamental material of your thoughts, of your feelings, of your attitudes, of your psychological posture, of your emotions, all of that. So when Takuan says that when you train, or when Yagyu says when you use ki, it doesn't mean that you learn to magically move things around with the power of your hands. It doesn't mean you learn to project laser beams or direct energy, out of your body and affect the other. It's not what it says. What it says is you will then learn to use um, reality as is. So that encompasses the physical aspect, the psychological aspect, the emotional aspect, all of that. You will learn to use this, right? So again, you see how, if this is the case, and it is indeed the case, then the practice of these arts can be used and can be extremely beneficial, because they cover uh, the entirety of the human sphere. So it's not just, again, it's not just your body, although it covers it. It's not just your psychology, although it covers it. It's not just even the ethics, although it covers it. These three things pertain to the individual. The new Confucian addition is, yeah, sure, 1, 2, and 3 as an individual, but you remember you're also part of a group. And so, consequence, um, this will also teach you how to behave in such fashion as to keep the group unified, as to perform your task, or as to meet your the expectations of the group in a productive and a positive way, right? So again, it might sound as something that limits the ability of the individual to choose for himself. In part, it is true, but you also need to remember that individualism is something that we can afford now because we have developed a society that can sustain it. Ancient China, ancient Japan could not do that for a variety of reasons, from the fact that again wars were very much present, the fact that communities had to rely on each other, the fact that natural disasters were, and as they are, very common, and that of course required a unified response, and so forth. So the spirit, you can call it, that you absorb when you start practicing martial arts is also the product of this evolution. So you are never seen as uh, the isolated element that can move and act regardless of. You're always seen as an individual which is integrated into something else, right? Something larger and broader, which of course is very, very important. So we can stop there for a second, and um, let's have a bit of a closer look at the psychological implications of such a practice. So there are two things that I'd like to point out in particular. The first one is that thank you very much, Veronica. So the first one is that how can I put this? Let me see. Some people might be tempted to associate um, the let's say the practice of martial arts with violence per se, right? With nothing but the deployment of brute force. That, of course, is not the case, but it is part of the game. It is part of the game. So let me put it this way. This is a bit of a controversial quote, but I think it serves the purpose. So just take it with a pinch of salt, okay? Um, Jordan Peterson once made this statement, which is a good man is not a weak man. A good man is a dangerous man that has it under voluntary control. It's not too far from what practice of martial arts should take you to. And this is what I mean. Um, in my experience, specifically, having practiced Kodokan Judo for quite a few years, some elements of Kōdōkan judo involve joint locks and they involve choking techniques, right? Together with throws from the standing position, which can be pretty devastating if you don't know how to fall, which is something that we'll cover in a moment. So these techniques, if applied, can have very serious consequences, right? The thing that happens is this, though: as you practice them, which means that you learn to perform them and someone else learns to perform them on you, what happens is that you bit by bit become aware of what you can do if you want. And also you become aware of what happens if you do something. And if you do something in the proper way or in a non-controlled way. So you certainly acquire the ability to do things that someone who is not trained would not normally do. But as you do so, you also become aware of the necessity to deploy self control, right? Why? Because you know what happens if you don't, right? So rather than keeping in a state of ignorance and just hoping that nothing happens, what you do when you practice is, well, let's confront what you can actually do, right? Here's what happens if you do this and this and that, okay? Or when someone does this to you. Therefore, now that you know, right, and the um, and the life-taking sword, and then we still have problems with connectivity. Sorry again. Okay, so this is to some extent similar to what Jung meant when he meant meeting the shadow. None of us, of course, would like to think of ourselves as people capable of doing terrible things. But the reality is that, given the proper circumstances, human beings can, right? The difference is someone who has never um, been confronted with the extent of his ability to cause damage, physical in this case, but also psychological and whatnot, does not know, right? Someone that knows because he has practiced with discipline, with control, with rules over time, is aware of it, and therefore has a very solid basis to choose not to, right? It's not the same thing. So the reason why, one of the reasons why I personally find the practice of martial arts so incredibly important, especially in children and young people, is precisely because it provides a controlled environment to, um, let's see, meet something that is potentially very dark and potentially dangerous, right? Because it lets you explore again within boundaries, within rules, within a framework that's designed to be safe for everyone. It lets you explore your potential for harm, your potential to do evil, right? To harm people. And then as you grow and as you acquire knowledge and competence and awareness, you at the same time, you also acquire the capacity to choose not to do that. That's very, very, very much, very important, right? And so that means that you also slowly move towards a fuller and deeper understanding of yourself, right? And not just in terms of what you can do physically, although it's also part of it. So if you practice for a sufficient for sufficient time, you became able to perform things that you simply wouldn't think you could, right? Just because you didn't know. Um, so there's an exploration of your body that otherwise you would not undergo. Um, but it's the relationship with the other, which is of course not necessarily the same person you train with every time. So you need to adapt. It's the relationship with the other that brings all these possibilities to the fore, right? So again, something very, very, very important, and something that leads you to understand that it's not all about you. It's not. It's about you and the other at the same time. Because you alone, you cannot do this, right? There's a reason why the Chinese word for uh, what is it? The virtue of humanity is written with the radical for person and the number two, because it takes two people to show virtue. All alone, you cannot do that, right? So the um, I think you could probably say that what Lacan says about um, uh, practicing the art of the art of sword, right? Practicing sword fighting with the perspective of potentially meeting your own demise or facing death. And this idea of confronting what you could potentially do, so the potential that resides within you, even if you're not aware of it, even if you've never done it, but the potential for that resides in you is essentially the same thing, is something that's very important for people to come in contact with and experience. Of course, in a context that allows you to do so safely, and it does not allow you to think that you can just do it because you can, right? It's exactly the opposite. It leads you to the other conclusion. Precisely because I could, and I know what the outcome would be, then I don't, right? And this is essentially what the Tao Te Ching says. That's again over 2,000 years ago, when it says that in the absence of rules, people would govern themselves, right? Why? Because you have interiorized that, so you don't need an exterior entity dictating you what you can or can't do. You know because you have experienced it through yourself, to your body. So you can say probably with a good degree of certainty that practice of martial arts is in fact a way of experiencing embodied learning at the same time across the physical, psychological, and ethical spectrum. It's not bad, right? It's not bad at all. Uh, Let me take you back real quick, and then we'll discuss um, just very briefly some of the physical aspects that are connected with the practice of martial arts, specifically with the fall. Oh, there you go. So we were saying before that, especially if you practice a martial arts like judo, in which you have full contact with the body of the other all the time, you come to experience yourself and the presence of the other, the physical, psychological, mental presence of yourself and the other in ways that otherwise you wouldn't. It's very, very similar in a way to what people do when they play rough and tumble play with their children. It's the same idea, but there is no technique in that particular case. Whereas in this case, in the case of martial arts, you have the technique, although the play field is the same, so to speak, right? So um, the first thing you would do when you practice Kōdōkan judo with someone is that you have to grab each other. So, and the second you do so, after a bit of practice, then you immediately understand how your position is, if you're balanced or not, if the other is balanced or not, if his or she is, um, what state of mind he or she is, and so forth. So it's nothing magic, of course. It's perfectly explainable in physiological terms, but it's a kind of experience that it's not immediately available, especially in some contexts in which physical contact is not exactly appreciated. Japan would be one of these, for example. You know probably that unlike people in the West, they tend not to shake hands, for example. So physical contact is very much restricted to certain contexts. The practice of martial arts is one of them, right? So much of what we said about the heart mind being like a mirror, so something that can reflect and adapt without being unbalanced or perturbed, also applies to the physical aspect of human beings, precisely because there is essentially no difference between what happens to your body and what happens inside of you, right? So one of the things that you learn very fast is to keep your balance, and that means you need to keep your posture in a certain way. This is especially true, I would say, in kendo rather than in judo. It is part of judo, of course, even historically speaking, because fighting in an upright, balanced position is the best way to maintain a balanced position that allows you to change and react very fast. But in my experience, at least, the quality of the posture is experienced in kendo is something unique, because since there is no immediate contact with the other, right? Basically, what you're touching the tip of the other sword, not you don't grab each other. The way that you carry yourself and you carry your body is a very startlingly precise reflection of the way you carry your mind heart in that particular moment, which is also part of the reason why Taquan said that Zen and the art of sword are essentially the same, because they force you to remove all the external stimuli, or they concentrate your attention not just in terms of space to the things that's exactly in front of you, which is your opponent or your companion, but also in terms of moment. So what you experience, and again, it's something magical, but it's very concrete, is um, is the presence, the constant, continuous presence in the moment that's going on as of now. So there is no worry of what happens before, what happened before, and no worries of what happens from now on. It's just, stable, balanced presence in the present moment, physical and psychological, which means, in Jungian terms, if you will, that you are slowly practicing and slowly growing in an integrated way. You're not your attention, your mind, your feelings, your body, they're not scattered all over the place. They're not distracted all over the place. They're concentrated, integrated in exactly as you are right here, right now, which is a deeply Buddhist concept, but it's also a deeply effective one, right? Because even removing the philosophical underpinnings, if you just concentrate on the pure effectiveness, if you act in a integrated, concentrated way, your result is much better than just dividing your attention, or breaking spreading your resources too thin, and moving to many directions at the same time. That's just pure logic, right? So that's how much you can derive from practicing a correct posture. It's wonderful, right? Then you have excellent results with regards to your bones, because the fact that you fall and you learn how to fall properly, of course, means an increase in bone density. You work on your muscle in a way that's harmonious. And again, here we need to draw a difference between the martial arts as a sport, particularly and specifically as in terms of a competition, and martial arts as they should be. So martial arts, as we said, they did not come from a milieu of we do this for sport, right? For entertainment. They came from the necessity to obtain the primacy on the battlefield, right? So the point was not winning a competition or getting a medal. The point was something else. So in the same way, the modern, um, let's say, the modern evolution of martial arts, to some extent, has drifted a bit too much, in my estimation, towards let's win the medal, and so let's do what we can to get the medal. That's not what martial arts were designed for, and that's not the way they can work for you, um, as they could, right? Because otherwise, you're just going back to the original setting, which was I need to win this fight. That's it. Now we don't die if we lose, of course, but there is no real, um, let's say, there's no real gain from aside from the fact that you won a competition, sure, but then the competition is over and your victory is past, and what's left for you, right? On the other hand, if you practice with the traditional, um, let's say, framework in mind, the payback is immense, because then you train and you win not against the other, but you win on you, which is, again, it's a concept it's already in multiple texts from the 17th century. The fact that victory is not victory over your opponent per se, victory is victory over you, right? Over your own ego, of your own weakness, of your own imperfection, and so forth. So it's growth. It's victory as growth, not victory as dominion, which is very, very important, right? Okay, and then of course, then you have there's one more thing that we should probably so that's what I was saying before. The person who devised the modern Kodokan Judo, who was a professor called Kanojigoro, wrote sorry, multiple times, and also said in his speeches that in his estimation, the only sport, physical activity that was designed to develop the body harmoniously was gymnastic. The problem with gymnastic was he meant calisthenics when he said gymnastics, not the Olympic sport. The problem with calisthenics, in his view, is that they didn't have any particular purpose aside from training the body, so they lacked interest. Whereas the practice of martial arts, while you train your body, you also acquire skills to do something else, and that's part of the interest that can derive from it. So it was a bit biased, of course, because it was his own thing, but that's how he framed it. So it's also true that if you do it in the proper way, which is not only competition, but competition or just combat practice and the practice of the established forms, that would be the kata in the typical in the technical language, then the development, the physical development is harmonious and not just you don't just develop one group muscle as opposed to another one, right? That's true for judo. It's also true for kendo in my experience. It's very much true, right? So the last part of the talk, we're almost there now. So the last part will be the use of how martial arts could be used to, let's say, to help integration. That's the easiest way I can put it. So let me start from a bit of a personal experience, and then I'll broaden the scope to include a bit more detail on the specifically on the topic of inclusion or integration, inclusion probably better, of people of Muslim, let's say, of Muslim background, and why it is necessary, from in my estimation, to do um, at least to have the discussion, right? So when I was very young, I helped my master, who has passed away a few years ago, in running the course for the low level practitioners in terms of belt, right? For the new ones, for the ones that were not very much experienced, which typically meant children. And back then, as well as today, there is a tendency, at least in my country, in Italy, to send children to judo when everything else fails. So whenever you have child who is displaying, um, how can I say this positively, who is displaying certain challenges in terms of, for example, adjusting to a situation or behavior, or things of that sort, very often judo is suggested as a possible way to help, because of the things that we have just discussed, of course, not explicitly in these terms, but uh, let's say experience indicates that very often positive results can be obtained. Pediatricians know, and so they often, in my country at least, they often offer this as a proposal. As a result, you might very well have, let's call it a class of that requires a lot of effort, which is of course part of the job if you are a master worthy of its salt. Now, I was never a master, and uh, I was again. I am a certified instructor, but I was never a master. It's a different thing. But whenever I helped, I did notice that people of different background, in any possible way, social, economic, and what political, and of course of different nationalities would then react differently to the same activity. So part of the difference, of course, is cultural. But some things, unless they are explicitly mentioned in training, and it's not really the case, at least here, might escape the understanding of the instructor or the master. And one of this was dealing with pupils of Muslim background. Why is that? Well, because one should know, without wanting to judge, of course, one should know that just like Confucianism is so pervasive in East Asia that even well after 2000 years, it's still the backbone of the organization of society. One could make the case that Islam is pretty much the same thing for countries that are now of Muslim majority, with a not insignificant addition that while Confucianism specifically refuses to engage with the metaphysical, Islam, being a religion, of course, engages with the physical and the metaphysical, both at the same time. So that means, in simpler terms, that for people that grow into the background, um, what they learn from that background is not something that can be easily discarded, right? It's something that is very, very often, either knowingly or unknowingly, is a big part of the decision they make, of the choices that they make, of the ways in which they react, and so forth. So, in our particular case, we had a couple of, let's say, early teens of Moroccan origin. No problem whatsoever. Families would be very cooperative and whatnot. One of them decided after a certain point to come to practice wearing a hijab. And my master handled it with absolutely no problem. He said, okay, fine. That's perfectly okay. So there was never problem per se, right? But it's important to know what it means. So as we have seen, the potential for development, for integration is enormous because especially in the case of Kōdōkan Judo, what you have is people that learn to handle each other in such a way as not to cause harm and allow for practice. And if you watch videos of not competitions but practice, you see people doing pretty astonishing things without getting hurt. So that means that as you practice, you learn how to not manipulate really, but you know how to handle your body and to handle your companion's body in such a way that it is at the same time respectful and safe. Okay, so it's enormously positive. The point is that in some contexts, for example, the contact between boys and girls is not encouraged, and that would be particularly the case. So while the opportunity per se is great, it might not always be possible because the idea that practice should be segregated, it's a bad word, practice should be separated per boys and girls, so boys on the side and girls on the other, or different times, different whatever, is supersedes the immediate benefits of the practice itself. So the reason is, of course, deeply connected with the way in which Islam, let's say, structures the admissible relationship between members of the opposite sex. And so let me just go over it again very quickly. It's not a super deep discussion, but it's the bare bones. It's the elements, fundamental elements that not just trainers, but educators should probably know when dealing with potentially a situation like this. So um, let's say, how can we put this in a way that's not um, too controversial? There is no, to my knowledge, that there is no declaration anywhere in the Quran that women are inferior because they're women. There is, however, a declaration, a very clear declaration, that there are differences between men and women, and maintaining those differences is something of significance for those that adhere to that particular philosophical or religious position, right? So part of that is signaled by the way people dress, and part of that, and that is partly regulated not so much by the individual, but by the context. So the core issue is the following. It's not the fact that you are a woman that means that you need to take certain steps, right? It's the fact that you are a woman or a man in a given context. Okay, so you probably have heard the word harem, right? You know what it means, but the actual word haram means at the same time prohibited. In some contexts, it can also mean sacred, right? So you see the connection. Now, um, there are passages in the Quran in which the Muslims are instructed on how to dress or how to behave, right? So it's important to note first that when it comes to clothing and dressing and behavior, those that are instructed first are men, right? So the message to, for example, lower the gaze, guard modesty, and stuff is first given to men and then is given to women. And then, because men and women are not the same, they are instructed to show that in two different ways. So, in the case of men, for example, it would be growing a beard, it would be not wearing silk unless for medical reasons, not wear sleeves that are over the elbow, and not wear trousers that are shortened, that expose the knee, and so forth, right? So, you have very precise instructions that are given, to men. Then, of course, there are the ones given to women that are different because women are not men and they are different in, again, the context that they were discussing right now. So, this doesn't mean, again, that per se it's meant to be discriminatory. It's not the original intent, but it is meant to signal a difference, right? And so the topic now becomes, which of the two should should take precedence, right? Because of course, and I have no answer to that. I'm just saying that um, oversimplifying the problem by saying that, yeah, they just need to cover because they're women. It's not doing any service to actually designing solutions that work, right? So again, I think it's too easy and it's too simple to simply say, oh, this is what it is, right? They all do that. They're all the same way. So you can put the situation in a box and slap a label on it and say, that's done. It's finished. That's how it is. Of course not, right? There are various degrees of adherence to certain precepts and not adherence to others. So it depends really on the context and the person that's in front of us in that particular moment. But it's important to know, right? I think whenever we are working with projects that deal with inclusion and martial arts, and there are people of a certain background, that these things might actually come up, and so it's a good idea to have at, at least a basic knowledge of what the problem might be and what the solution might look like, right? So aside from the idea of wearing or not a head covering, um, which in the case of, for example, kendo is not problematic because you would wear a mask anyway, so that's a secondary issue. And in the case of Kōdōkan Judo, there are now plenty of solutions that are available in case that's a necessity. The real problem is that, as we said before, there is very little use for handshakes in Japanese culture, and so the practice of martial arts would start and end with a bow. So that's exactly what it is. It's the equivalent of a handshake. It's not meant to show submission, devotion, or anything like that. It's the way the Japanese culture has um, come to embody the idea of saluting something or someone, right? Simple as that, right? It's a demonstration of respect, and that's exactly what it is. However, as you know, there is a very similar movement. Uh, Particularly, sorry, I skipped a passage. The bowing comes in two fashions in Japan. One is standing, the other one is kneeling, and bowing while kneeling is the most formal of the two, and it's the one designed to show the greatest respect. There is a very similar movement during the performance of Islamic prayer called salat, and the movement is called sujud, which is prosternation, right? So the problem is this, that um, the way prosternation is framed in Islam, it's to indicate and demonstrate uh, the act of worshiping. So it is exclusively performed towards God, right? So doing that particular gesture, movement, with that particular intention, worshiping is only admissible if the object of worship is God, right? If that's not the case, then it is considered shirk, which is one of the worst possible sins in the Islamic context, which is worshiping something that is not God, right? So that's a very, very serious thing. Again, be careful. It doesn't mean that everybody uh, takes it in the same way, but it does mean that this is something you need to remember, you have to have in mind, right? So bowing while kneeling, or even bowing while standing, could potentially be a problem for this precise reason, because it could be in certain contexts, in certain discourses, can be seen as a demonstration of devotion or worshiping towards something that is not God and therefore is not permissible. So um, we in the Christian context we did have a similar discussion by Thomas Aquinas, who differentiated between the concept of dulia and the concept of latria. So if you are familiar, for example, um, with the Catholic uses, you know that there are saints. You know that there are not worshipped exactly, but they are prayed to. And you know that there's the Mary, who is not worshipped but is prayed to. So the Thomas Aquinas says that the prayers that are devoted to the saints or Mary are not worshipping, because we know perfectly well that the saints were human, that Mary was human, so it's not God. So that's an act of dulia, which is of deep respect, right? Or veneration, if you want, but it's not worshiping. Whereas latria, it's specifically praying to God with intention of praying to God, and that's a different thing. So the way you break it is that um, praying to God with the intention of addressing God in the particular context is one thing, and showing respect to someone who is obviously human is not the same. It's not the same thing, right? So there is no no uniformity of opinion in the with regards to the permissibility or not at the level of the Islamic jurisprudence. But there have been several experts by the University of Al-Azhar of in Egypt that have said that the bowing in the context of sport as a demonstration of sportsmanship is permissible precisely because it's not designed to be an act of worship. So if um, if the context is one that might be conducive to this kind of situation, if you're a trainer or a master or an educator, right, and you anticipate that you could face these things, these are a few notions that you might find helpful and that you can use to further your research and design solutions um, that are more effective than it would be otherwise, right? Than just walking into a situation that you don't fully understand. That was the last element of our talk. I am very grateful for all of you for joining and staying with me until the end. I hope you found it useful, and I will now leave you to your well-deserved slumber, um, with the hope that uh, this could be useful for you in whatever way you might want to use the things we have covered and that we have discussed together. So, thank you very much, and you have a good night.